Willkommen, bienvenue, welcome to Eddie's Encyclopedia of Musicals. I am Eddie, and today I'm going to talk about Tick, Tick, Boom, a musical that I had the pleasure of seeing live in San Francisco a few days ago. Warning, there will be spoilers for this musical, so if you haven't seen it yet, you might want to go check out the movie and then come back to this episode. Tick, Tick, Boom is a musical by Jonathan Larson, which recently has exploded in interest among musical theater enthusiasts due to its film adaptation from 2021, which was directed by Hamilton creator Lin-Manuel Miranda and starred Andrew Garfield. Like many, I was introduced to this musical via the film. I was aware of it prior to that, and I knew Larson's story already, but I had never gotten around to checking it out until the movie came out. The movie adaptation of Tick, Tick, Boom is one of my all-time favorite movies. Not just musical movies, but movies in general. I can wax poetic about this movie, and I probably will in this podcast episode. Since falling in love with the film, I have seen the stage production twice, once in Long Beach and now once in San Francisco. I'm actually thinking about going back and seeing the San Francisco one again next week. Both were very good productions, with actors who embodied their roles well. And that's something that I love so much about LA and San Francisco. Even their small theaters put on high-quality shows. These were small theaters, maybe 15 rows of seats each, and both times I sat in one of the first few rows. So I have a lot of familiarity with Tick, Tick, Boom at this point. I've listened to the album scores of times, usually the original off-Broadway version with Raul Esparza, Amy Spanger, and Jerry Dixon, but sometimes I listen to the movie version instead. It's one of my favorite musical scores, especially of the rock musical genre. It's very re-listenable, right? It's very easy to listen to over and over. So what is Tick, Tick, Boom? It's a semi-autobiographical musical by Jonathan Larson. It wasn't actually written as the musical that we know and love today. It originated as a rock monologue that Larson himself performed. Basically, he sat at his piano on stage and talked to the audience and had these songs mixed in as relevant. It's about his experience writing his first musical, Superbia, and his frustrations with the theater industry. You've heard of the musical Superbia, right? That dystopian futuristic sci-fi adaptation of 1984, warning of media desensitization? Doesn't ring a bell? That's because it never got produced. In fact, the movie adaptation of Tick, Tick, Boom contains the most music from Superbia that has ever been released. A whopping 2 songs. Sextet and Come to Your Senses, the latter of which has been in Tick, Tick, Boom since its inception. Tick, Tick, Boom is a tragic story. It recounts Jonathan's experience writing his show and his hope going into his first ever workshop, but it just doesn't work out. And Jonathan is left bitter and confused and dejected that his show that he has poured so many years into, so much intention and depth and meaning, just is looked at as too risky for Broadway. That's what the agent in Tick, Tick, Boom says, at least. It's too risky, too artistic for Broadway, too big and expensive for off-Broadway. It doesn't have a home. Meanwhile, Broadway churns out mega musicals, massive spectacles of shows that often say very little and rarely try to challenge their audiences. That's the basic story of Tick, Tick, Boom and its relationship to Superbia. Like I said, Tick, Tick, Boom wasn't originally the musical that we're familiar with. It was a rock monologue. It didn't become a musical until around 2021, several years after Larson's death. It's been expanded and presumably more fictionalized to elaborate on this story and dramatize it. The film, which came out in 2021, further elaborates on the story. The movie puts more effort into establishing the background of the world Jonathan Larson was writing in and writing about. The movie feels to me like a cross between the original Tick, Tick, Boom and Larson's other musical, Rent. It puts so much more focus on things like the AIDS epidemic, which Larson's friends were very affected by. In the stage production, Michael getting HIV comes out of nowhere, and they never actually say that word. They mostly allude to it. The movie demonstrates how prevalent the epidemic was in Jonathan's life, which adds further understanding into why he wrote Rent. The degree to which the AIDS epidemic was highlighted is not the only instance of the movie digging deeper and being more detailed than the stage production, but it's the most salient instance. These additions make the story feel less about like it's just about a writer who's struggling to write, which, as A Strange Loop and Michael Jackson reminded us, no one cares about, and more like an actual biography. The main character feels less smarmy and self-absorbed when he's actively struggling with feeling useless and incapable of helping the horrors around him. We realize that he writes what he writes as his contribution to the cause. One of the reasons Rent took off was because of how it portrayed people with AIDS, how it humanized them, the way that it portrayed them as not just dying victims, but as people who still had agency of their own lives, who could have goals and make friends and fall in love and be happy in spite of their sickness. The stage production of Tick, Tick, Boom doesn't really allude to Larson's future work, but the movie does a wonderful job of tying that future work into the background of Jonathan's present life, with these additional subplots, and also with Easter eggs like Jonathan receiving a voicemail about someone's sound equipment not working, very reminiscent of the Tango Maureen. One of my favorite things about the movie adaptation of Tick, Tick, Boom is the sheer amount of Broadway cameos and Easter eggs. From the Sunday scene that people joked was the musical equivalent of Avengers Endgame, to half the casts of the original Into the Woods and Rent appearing, to the actual Stephen Sondheim's voicemail. There are more theater actors than non-theater actors in this movie, and they're all connected to Larson himself, or Lin-Manuel Miranda, who directed the movie, or Stephen Sondheim, who was Larson's mentor. The scene in which John is workshopping Superbia for Stephen Sondheim is my favorite scene for Easter eggs. Not only does it have the highest volume of cameos of any scene in the film, but I think it has the most meaningful, though the most easily overlooked, cameos. The camera pans over the bleachers to show the other students in the workshop. Every single person in the bleachers is an actual Broadway composer, lyricist, or librettist. Not only that, but every one of their magnum opuses, magnum opus? My Latin's rusty. Anyway, was a rock musical or a rock-inspired musical written at least 4 years after Rent hit Broadway. From The Last 5 Years to Hairspray, to Next to Normal, to In the Heights, to Hamilton, to Fun Home, to Wicked, to The Prom, to Dear Evan Hansen, to Be More Chill, to Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812, these musicals all boast at least some influence from Jonathan Larson's work. Rent paved the way for many of these musicals to portray the types of stories and characters that they portray. It inspired many actors and writers to pursue theater, especially people of color. And it created new Broadway superstars whose presence made their shows stand out. Several of the writers in this scene, such as Dave Malloy, Shaina Taub, and Joe Iconis, were recipients of the Jonathan Larson Grant, which funds aspiring musical theater writers. So many of these writers wouldn't be where they are today if it weren't for the legacy of Jonathan Larson. And this scene is, in a sense, Jonathan Larson's legacy. I think that's why so many of these writers were a part of it. They all wanted to pay tribute to one of the writers who influenced their work and changed the face of musical theater, even if he managed to only do it with 1.5 musicals. Enough about Easter eggs and subplots. Let's get to my favorite thing about musicals, the lyrics. I've said already that Tick, Tick, Boom has one of my favorite musical scores, especially in the rock musical genre. Part of this is because the music itself is so memorable and fun. But lyrics are really important to me, and good lyrics tend to be why I find certain scores more re-listenable than others. I love nothing more than to hear a score where I find some new detail every time I listen to it. Whether it's a rhyme or a turn of phrase, it can be anything. I just love reveling in the intentionality of the lyricist. Stephen Sondheim is the go-to lyricist for this description. Everybody talks about him like that. You can listen to his musicals constantly and just keep finding new clever rhymes, new plays on words, new quotes that just resonate deeply or rip your heart out. I think Jonathan Larson is another such lyricist. Jonathan Larson had a lot of fun or interesting rhymes. Actually, he's the lyricist that really got me thinking about rhymes from a linguistic perspective. I remember it was the rhyme Neverland and Forever and in 3090 that I spent so long wondering why it was okay, why it was an acceptable rhyme. That's the rhyme that made me realize that we linguists have more to do in studying rhyme, because I don't think the current literature on the topic explains the acceptability of that one. I wasn't actually planning on talking so much about rhyme in this episode since I talked all about it in the last one on Funny Girl, but I guess I'm going to. Like I said in the Funny Girl episode, there are 3 parts to a syllable: the nucleus, which is the vowel; the onset, which is the consonant or cluster of consonants that precede it; and the coda, which is the consonant or cluster of consonants that follow the nucleus. You match the nucleus and the coda between 2 syllables, and you've got a rhyme, right? Cat and rat, for example. But rhyme transcends syllable structure. A rhyme goes from the stressed syllable to the final coda of the word or phrase. That's how we get multisyllabic rhymes. Rabbit and habit, for example. Back when I was doing my master's in linguistics and just getting into this rhyme stuff, I had a professor who had conducted a research project on imperfect rhymes, specifically using Bob Dylan's work. Remember, imperfect rhymes are any rhyme where something between the stressed nucleus and the final coda of the word or phrase doesn't match. It can be cat and map, or cat and cad for 1-syllable rhymes, or rabbit and rabid, or rabbit and vapid for 2-syllable rhymes. But there's a pattern here. There is. It might not look like it, but there is a linguistic pattern. Okay, this gets a little complicated based on my experience teaching intro to linguistics classes. I'll try to summarize this simply. Every consonant in every language in the entire world can be described as having 3 phonetic features. This means that when we produce a consonant, our vocal tract essentially does 3 things simultaneously in order to produce that specific unique consonant. I can actually explain this simpler, I think. A lot of you guys are probably musicians, which will help. The vocal tract is essentially a wind instrument like a flute. Think of how a flute works. You blow air into it, you press certain valves to shape the airflow, and you get a specific, unique note. That is pretty much exactly how we produce speech. We have air going through our vocal tract from our lungs, and we use our tongue or our lips to shape the airflow as it escapes our mouths and noses. By the way, the nose is part of the vocal tract. Plug your nose and try saying an N or an M sound. It's going to come out like a D or a B. And that's why it's become so hard to talk when you're sick or crying and your nose is stuffy. Your nose is very relevant to speaking. Anyway, you shape the airflow to produce different sounds. And there are 2 ways of doing this, and both happen at the exact same time. 1, you control the amount of airflow allowed through the vocal tract. You create a constriction of air. That's pretty much how a consonant is defined, by the way. It's an intentional constriction of airflow in the vocal tract. Vowels are very unrestricted, comparatively. Make a T sound, right? T. Your tongue completely cuts off air by being pressed against your alveolar ridge or your teeth, depending on how you pronounce your T's. The alveolar ridge is that little ridge right behind your teeth before it goes up into the hard palate. So make a T sound. T, a T. You should be able to feel the difference in the openness of your mouth between the vowel and the T. Now try S's. S, a S. Still much less open than the vowel, but you can feel and hear the friction of the constricted airflow moving through your tongue. T, s, right? It's a small but noticeable difference in the openness of your mouth. That difference in openness is called manner of articulation by phoneticians, and all other linguists, but phoneticians who study sound production and perception, and phonologists who study sound patterns and syllable structure and stress, are the primary ones who care about this stuff. If you're a syntactician who studies sentence structure, you probably don't care much about what's going on with consonants. Anyway, manner of articulation. The degree to which the airflow is constricted in the vocal tract. That is one of those 3 features that we linguists talk about when we describe consonants. The second feature is where that constriction occurs in the vocal tract. Let's go back to that T sound. T, a T. You make it by pressing your tongue against your teeth or your alveolar ridge. What about a P sound? P, a P. T and P are actually very similar when you think about it. They both completely cut off airflow. T, P, T, P. No airflow. The mouth completely closes for P. P, 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 right? Completely closes. That's the only difference between T and P, where the constriction occurs. We have maybe 8 or 10 places through the vocal tract where we produce this constriction of air. These are called the places of articulation. So they all have names, but you don't need to know that. So we have manner of articulation, which describes how much air is constricted, and we have place of articulation, which is where in the mouth that constriction is happening. The third and final feature that we use to describe consonants happens further down in the vocal tract within the voice box itself. You have vocal cords in your voice box. These are tiny folds through which the air passes to go through your mouth, or nose, right? That's how we make the N or M sound. We redirect airflow through the nose. As air passes through these vocal cords, we can open them wide so that air passes through them really well, or we can close them almost entirely to create a creaky sound, like this. Or we can have them kind of open so that the air flaps them as it goes through and they make noise. This is called voicing. You can hear the difference very distinctly, but you can actually feel it too. Put your fingers on the middle of your throat where your Adam's apple is if you're a guy, or where it would be if you aren't, and say the sound S, the S sound. S, just for a moment. S, you should feel nothing. Absolutely nothing. Now try Z. Zzz, you should feel the vibrations in your throat with your fingers. And of course you can hear it as well, very distinctive difference. Voicing is the third and final phonetic feature that distinguishes consonants. So we have place of articulation, manner of articulation, and voicing. All consonants across all languages in the entire world can be identified and named through these three features. What does any of this have to do with Tick Tick Boom? Okay, I said there was a rhyme, Neverland and Forever and, in 3090. It's a 3-syllable rhyme, but it isn't a perfect rhyme. If it were perfect, everything from that stressed syllable through the final nd sound would match in both words, but they don't. Neverland has an L in the onset of the third syllable, and Forever and has nothing there. Cool. What does place, manner, and voicing have to do with this? I said I had a professor who researched imperfect rhymes. He discovered that there's a pattern to imperfect rhymes. It's not unusual to get a rhyme like cat and cap, or cat and cad. But it would be weirder to get a rhyme like cat and cass. And indeed, those rhymes show up less frequently. What's going on here? Let's look at cat and cap. What's the difference between a T and a P? Just the place of articulation. These words are so close to matching. They match by a whole nucleus and 2/3 of a coda consonant. They're so close. The same thing with cat and cad. T versus D. All that changes is voicing. T doesn't create that vibrating in your throat when you say it. D does. Albeit not a lot, but there's complications with the specific sounds in English. But there is a voicing distinction. Now, cat and cass. T versus S. That's a difference in manner of articulation. All three of these pairs are 1/3 of a consonant off, but which third determines how good the rhyme is. I actually conducted a study on this, creating a gradient of rhymes to determine how good each rhyme is considered. I need to expand on that research because there's just more to do, but the current literature basically says that imperfect rhymes can only be off by 1/3 of a consonant. There's some other things too, like word final S's and D's don't, and Z's and T's, right? Like in the past tense or the third person singular, those don't count as part of the word. It gets complicated, but that's not relevant here. But Jonathan Larson rhymed Neverland and Forever and. There's a difference there that isn't explained here. There's a whole consonant missing, the onset of the last syllable, yet the rhyme kind of works. This is the rhyme that got me really thinking about rhymes, like I said. Why is this rhyme acceptable? I think it's not a 3-syllable rhyme at all. I think it's a series of 3 1-syllable rhymes, and. They all match perfectly. I don't know. I'm still working on researching this stuff. But Jonathan Larson created a rhyme that has kept me up at night for 2 years, and so he's one of my favorite lyricists. But rhyme isn't the only thing about Larson's lyrics that's cool or distinctive. The content of the discourse in his lyrics is really interesting. No one creates as visual a scene with words as Jonathan Larson does. Look at songs like Boho Days or monologues like the opening ones of Tick Tick Boom or Rent. He completely brings an entire scene to life in your mind with incredible detail just through words. Boho Days is a great example, and one of my favorite songs by Larson. The way the bohemian New York apartment life is depicted through stanzas like showers in the kitchen, there might be some soap, dishes in the sink, brush your teeth if you can cope, toilets in the closet, you'd better hope there's a light bulb in there. The way this lifestyle, the depression and the poverty and everything, is succinctly but explicitly defined is just remarkable. And there are better examples of this through his work, but this is just the one that comes to mind right now. Finally, Jonathan Larson did some really cool things with other phonological matchings than just rhyme. Like I said, he really played with the acceptability of a rhyme, and we see this throughout Tick, Tick, Boom, Rents, and what little of Superbia we have. Another rhyme that just tickles my brain is in Superbia's sextet. Century and adventure we. 2 words, right? Adventure, we, adventure. Century and adventure we. Again, it's playing with onsets to create what I think are 3 single syllable rhymes back to back to back. But this isn't the only way he played with onsets. He also liked alliteration, right? And that's how you create alliteration, is by matching onsets. One of my favorite lines in musical theater is from Come to Your Senses. If you're just an empty image emanating out of the screen. This is almost an entire line of alliteration. An empty image emanating out of the screen. 7 alliterative words in a row. 7. That's just so cool. This is alliteration because the onsets of the words all match, right? There's no onset, it's null. And so it matches across all of these words. And that's just so cool. And it gets cooler. The first four words have initial syllables that are so similar. They all start with a front lax vowel, a, or I, and end with a voiced nasal coda, n or m, right? So we've got an, m, im, m. It's so close. These are almost rhymed syllables. They're each off by either a third of a consonant or a fourth of a vowel or both. They're so close. I just love this line. It's just so cool. All right, I think that's enough for geeking out over language and linguistics, and lyrics. That's a wrap for this episode of Eddie's Encyclopedia of Musicals. I hope you found it entertaining and informative, and thank you for listening.